Now we're going to go ahead and begin to look more at these properties. I'm going to clear my canvas a little bit by deleting a few of these. So I'm just going to delete that one, this one, and that one. And we're going to be left with just this one circular synthetic primitive. Now I'm going to click on it on the list, and then I'm going to move it around so that we can see that it is in fact a circle. I'm also going to go ahead and launch a square like so. Because the first thing that I want to look at here is some of the ways in which we can adjust the fall off. These three buttons here adjust the fall off as far as the edges of these objects are concerned. So if you notice here, there's a slider for fall off. And if I pull this all the way down to 0, what you'll see is that we end up with basically a circular object. The reason why is because the edges of that square have fallen off and there just becomes this smooth gradient from basically black to that 500 watts light. So if I increase the fall off all the way up, you'll see that we end up with a pure 500 watt square of light with no fall off whatsoever. So the idea with these three fall off buttons is that this is going to more or less be the same as setting the fall off percentage to 100. Whereas this linear fall off is going to be more of a linear ramp from fully on down to more or less fully off. And of course, this is going to depend greatly on where we have this slider. And then finally, this curve ramp is going to give us a little bit more of a natural fall off, and particularly true when we're working with a low fall off somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 or 0. You can just barely see the edges of the square there. Now, why does this become important, and when would you want to use this? Well, obviously, if you're wanting to have a square shape, then the quickest thing to do is just to simply click on this first fall off. However, generally speaking, you're going to want to go ahead and use this fall off for the most natural lights, and particularly for a low fall off percentage like 0, which is what I tend to work at. Now let's see how that works with our circular primitive here. So if I turn the fall off down to 0, you'll see that we basically end up with the exact same thing as if we have our fall off set to 0 over here. Basically two circular objects, even though they're not circular. The reason why this is important is because these buttons up here also have an impact. So if I hit solid, what this does is it effectively makes the outside edges of the solid. Now we can't see that immediately until we put it over here. Then you can see that the edges of that box are in fact solid, meaning that the black is not transparent. It is opaque and it's blocking out. Even though this appears to be circular, it's not. It's giving us that rectangular edge. Now if I turn off solid, you'll see that these two shapes blend. And this can allow us to have some really interesting sort of morphing shapes in our reflections, which are very nice. Now, likewise, we can also do a dark. And what this effectively does is make this a light blocking emitter, more or less. It's using the shape that we have in terms of our fall off and our bulb situation as far as this being a square primitive, and it's blocking out a certain amount of light. Right now, I happen to be blocking out 500 wattage. Now, the next one is half. And what half does is effectively cut that bulb in half. And again, we'll see that more appropriately if we increase the fall off, something like so, and maybe do something like linear. So you can see that we end up with this very different shaped object than a square by simply using the half and using our fall off accordingly. And then finally, we have the outside. And what the outside is doing, let me turn off half, is it's taking our fall off all the way to the outside edge. So let me just go ahead and turn this down to 0 and you'll see what I mean. It's increasing our fall off to the outside edge. If we don't have this on, you'll see that our fall off stays within that square. However, if we have the outside on, it's increasing our fall off to make sure that we have even a little bit of fall off all the way into the corners, which could be a desirable quality in certain circumstances. Now, these other sliders are basically pretty self-explanatory. The wattage is increasing from 0 to 10,000 watts. However, the first 1,000 occupy the first half, and then we work in basically 1,000 increments all the way down to 10,000. The reason why is because you want to have fine control here in the beginning and then larger control towards the end when you want big changes. Now, bear in mind that the wattage that we set here is going to be directly impacted by what our exposure setting is for our Maxwell camera. And remember that I was using an EV of 8. So this is going to work fine for an EV of 8 at 500 watts. However, if we wanted to have like a daylight scene, then we would need to use a much higher EV. Now, below that we have bulb length, and this is going to be much more apparent here if we switch over to something like this and we increase our fall off just a little bit so that we can see a little bit of that fall off. I'm going to go ahead and increase our bulb length, and what that's going to do is it's going to pull out, and you can see that we end up with something that looks kind of like a fluorescent tube. And if we reduce our fall off, we've effectively ended up with something that's not all that dissimilar from a fluorescent tube. Now, if I reduce the height, like so, then we're going to get something that's even more like a fluorescent tube. Now, you may notice that as I'm moving up the canvas, the objects, the primitives, are automatically distorting. And the reason why is because they have to be mapped onto a sphere. So this is automatically doing your spherical mapping for you. Now, also notice that we have that sort of fluorescent shape, which is creating a very nice reflection here on our object. So I'll just leave that as is, and I'll create another square so that we can look at the rest of these settings here. So not only do we have bulb length, which is again going to kind of stretch out our bulb and give us a different shape. And you can see we have kind of more of a lozenge shape here because I didn't pull it all the way out. But we also have bulb position. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to move the light to be centered at the top, or the light to be centered at the bottom, or any point in between. Now, this can lead to some interesting shapes. If you've messed with your bulb length and your bulb position and you decrease your fall off, you can end up with some very, very interesting shapes that maybe you wouldn't necessarily expect to come from a simple rectangular or square type primitive synthetic emitter. Now, below this, we have opacity, and opacity is just like what it sounds. It's going to impact the opacity of that particular emitter, and the lower we have the opacity, the less we see that emitter, and of course, the less impact it's going to have on our scene in Maxwell. So generally speaking, you don't want to work with the opacity too much unless you have a particular reason to do so. The last thing that we want to look at here is the color. Now the color, by clicking this color, it's going to launch the system color palette, and we can pick any color we want. And maybe I'll just pick something like, an orange color. That'll work. And now you can see that this synthetic square, which is what we started with, is now set to a 500 watt orange. And of course, we can see that directly impacting our Maxwell fire render. So that concludes this half of our properties. Now we're going to look a little bit more at this other half of our properties in the next video.